On June the 24th, 1812, the first French troops crossed the Niemen River near the town of Kovno-Kaunas. This was the beginning of the war called the Russian Campaign by the French and the Great Patriotic War of 1812 by the Russians. When Napoleon formed his first army back in 1805, pulling together all the major forces of his empire, he called it the Grand Army. However, only half of the troops were French. It comprised Dutch, Swiss, Portuguese, Danish, Polish, Spanish, German, Italian, Wallonian and Flemish soldiers. Napoleon used to say, "The entire Europe is with me." In June 1812, Napoleonic Horse Guards, 10 military corps, crossed the Russian border and 2 more were in reserve. Russians had some 200,000 troops along the empire's western borders. They were split in 3 western armies. The first Western Army under General Barclay de Tolly, the second Western Army under General Prince Bagration, and the third one led by General Tormasov. Russians based their strategy on the assumption that Napoleon would be attacking one of the armies, while the remaining 2 would be making things difficult for the French troops and secure success in this challenging battle situation. But war is war, and all strategies went astray after the first shots were fired. The French troops appeared to be more numerous than the Russian command had expected, and Napoleon attacked both de Tolly's and Bagration's armies with all his might, so that Russians had no room for maneuver and the only option was to retreat. On the other hand, Napoleon was surprised that Russians didn't engage in a fight, but started retreating farther, destroying villages, warehouses and crops on their way. On June the 28th, 4 days after Napoleon invaded the Russian Empire, we cannot call it Russia as it comprised Polish territories, he entered Vilnius, the then Vilno. According to all sources, the emperor was very sad on that day, as he felt a deep abyss awaiting him. What to do next? Continue to pursue the enemy until victory, or stop and try to take over the territory of the former Rzeczpospolita, today's Lithuania and Belarus, settle down and try to force Alexander I into peace. Napoleon stayed in Vilno for about 19 days, hesitant about what to do next, but finally deciding to advance. Why? Well, because he perfectly realized that time would be against him if he didn't follow the Russian army, in hope that it would sooner or later stop for a pitched battle, which Napoleon would win and undoubtedly make the Russians conclude a victorious peace. The first and second Western armies were deployed to the south of West Daugava. When Napoleon stepped onto the territory of the Empire and crossed the Niemen River, he rapidly advanced, breaking the first and the second armies apart. The main task of the Russians was to avoid the strike of Napoleon's excessive forces and rejoin as soon as possible to have room for maneuver. Both Russian armies were retreating until they rejoined in Smolensk, and that was a very important moment. You see, the former border between Rzeczpospolita and Russia was around today's border between Russian Federation and Belarus. It was actually ancient Russian territory, perceived by the troops and peasants as their native land. Locals in Lithuania were pro-Napoleon, Belarusians were neutral, but people living behind the borderline of 1772 were hostile to Napoleon. Here, Russian soldiers felt that they were protecting their motherland. So for Russians, the Patriotic War began in early August 1812. A rapid advance march from Niemen to Vitebsk made the French troops scatter. The Russian command ordered the troops to move from Smolensk to Vitebsk, that hosted the major forces of the Grand Army, to shatter some of the French corps and thus cool the emperor off. Napoleon resorted to an unexpected maneuver. He left some units to screen the advancing Russians and moved his major forces south, traversing the Dnieper River and heading to Smolensk. On its way to Smolensk, the French military avant-garde met with the 27th Infantry Division of General Niverovsky that was to control this not-so-dangerous sport. It faced a fierce battle and had to retreat amid difficult conditions, suffered great casualties, but managed to hold the French avant-garde. As soon as the Second Army commander Bagration was informed about one of his divisions being attacked on the southern bank of Dnieper, he ordered to turn around and head to Smolensk to support the division. A somewhat curious episode in the story was the carelessness of the commander of the 2nd Grenadier Division, Karl Mecklenburg. When the 2nd Western Army was to set off from Smolensk to Vitebsk, Karl Mecklenburg got drunk and failed to wake up and head his division to march off on time. You see, according to the then military rules, the senior division was to march first, thus the entire 2nd Western Army was suspended. So by the time Bagration was informed about Napoleon moving along Dnieper, his army was still near Smolensk. This funny incident enabled Bagration's army to make a timely U-turn, support the advancing division led by Niverovsky, and take Smolensk over, depriving Napoleon of a chance to seize the city and make it to the rear guard of the Russian troops, giving them a decisive battle in a disposition on which the emperor counted. The battle for Smolensk lasted for several days and left it almost in ruins in the end. The Russian command decided to leave the city and carry out a retreat towards Moscow. Since the two Russian armies now were joined, relations between General Bagration and General Barclay de Tolly became very tense. A lack of uniform command appeared nearly fatal for the troops during their retreat from Smolensk. Uncoordinated actions of the Russians triggered a dangerous disposition on the crossroads near the Valutino mountain. Bagration's army already passed it, while de Tolly's troops failed to make it. The second split of the two armies seemed inevitable, the consequences of which would be tragic. The mess and chaos didn't let the French troops objectively assess the situation, and Russians got a chance to keep the crossroads, and Barclay's First Army was led to continue its retreat towards Moscow. By that time it was clear that strategic splitting of the army would cause problems and errors and put the troops on the verge of a catastrophe. Alexander I called up a council in St. Petersburg to discuss candidates to lead the troops, and so General of the Infantry Mikhail Kutuzov was chosen. It was a difficult time for taking the lead as the troops were continuing their retreat, distancing from the border and approaching Moscow. Kutuzov's task was to give a battle to stop Napoleon and by all means stop him from entering the city. Napoleon also long awaited the decisive battle, eager to throw all his forces against the Russians. He naturally believed that, outnumbering the enemy, he would easily destroy it, the same as he did before, and thus put the final dot in the campaign. The situation was changing, though. The Russian army was retreating and was joined by more reserve formations, recruits and volunteers. So its numbers grew, while the French army was losing people with every kilometer covered. It lost a lot of people when marching ahead. Thus, By the time of the Borodino battle, the Russian army had some 150,000 troops, some 100,000 of experienced professional soldiers, and 50,000 recruits, Cossacks, etc., while the French army had 135,000 troops, which were nevertheless top and elite soldiers. All inexperienced and unprofessional French soldiers were killed in previous battles, while the Russian army was reinforced by such soldiers. So the two armies were almost equal in force at Borodino. Kutuzov just had a feeling that Borodino was the time and place for a battle and deployed the army near the village. September the 7th, 1812, 26th of August, according to the Julian calendar then used in Russia, was the day of one of the fiercest pitched battles of the Napoleonic era. Expecting a defensive battle, Kutuzov was to block the main road leading to Moscow, the new Smolensk road. He positioned the troops bearing this in mind, but Napoleon outwitted him. Late at night, on September the 6th, the major part of Napoleon's army crossed the Koloch River and faced the left flank of the Russian army, Bagration's disposition. These military units saw the strongest French strike at dawn. In fierce fighting, the armies kept gaining and losing the Bagration flashes. The French dragged their artillery very close to General Rayevsky's redoubt, shooting almost point-blank at the second line of defense. The artillery attacked from both sides at a very short distance, 300-400 meters in grape shot, and the artillery was the one to suffer the heaviest losses. The French burst into the Russian left flank like mad to smash it as soon as possible. Conventional historians write about 8 attacks, but now we know a different story. The battle began at 6 a.m. The Bagration flashes were taken over around 10 a.m., with Prince Bagration deadly wounded. Then the French occupied General Rayevsky's redoubt. Both armies suffered great losses. The Russian army had to step back, but still remained very brave and heroic. Finally, at 3 p.m., the two armies somehow collided and smashed into each other. The losses were unimaginable. People were fighting till their last breath. Russians, French, Saxons, Poles, all should be proud of taking part in the battle, as they were all heroes. By 3 p.m. everyone was exhausted and the armies had lost thousands of dead and wounded. But Napoleon still had 20,000 of his best troops left, while the Russians had only 2 Guards regiments, Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky, that were kept in reserve. French marshals begged Napoleon to let the Guards join the assault, believing that this would secure victory. Napoleon almost made an order to this effect when he found out that his left flank had been attacked by the Cossacks. Now, these were the Cossacks led by Platov and Uvarov, whose cavalry attacked the left flank. And the Cossack assault brought no results in terms of tactics, but it made Napoleon postpone the Guards' attack until he got reports that the Cossacks had been forced back. The right moment for the attack had passed, and the legend has it that when Napoleon finally made up his mind, Marshal Bessières whispered to him, "Sir, you are 800 leagues away from your capital, and the Guards is all you have left in reserve." And so Napoleon changed his mind. Both sides went through cavalry and artillery storms, and by the end of the day, the battle died out amid the starting rain. One of the world's greatest battles was over. The outcome was the following. Russians lost some 45,000 people. The French troops, according to authoritative documents, lost some 30,000 people, plus a couple of thousands unregistered casualties, which makes it about 34,000 people total. Thus, the French troops lost fewer people and advanced 1 kilometer deeper into Russia's defense line. Tactically speaking, the French won the Borodino battle. But if it were a sports event, Napoleon would have needed to score 5-0 to win, and the score was 5-4, hardly making it. This victory had no strategic effect for the emperor. Thus, statements by a number of Russian historians that Russia won the battle make sense. The Russian army was not defeated, and this alone was a strategic victory for the Russians. Napoleon had needed a crushing victory, one that would have led to a truce. However, what he secured was only a tactical win, and even that came at a high price.
After the
Borodino battle, the Russian army kept on retreating towards Moscow and stopped near the village of Fili. Kutuzov called up a military council to discuss an issue that was rather of a moral and political character than war-related. The military council, which took place right at the site where we are talking now, was to decide on Moscow's fate, whether the Russian troops would be defending it or leave it without a fight and continue their retreat. The generals had different opinions and failed to agree. Then Mikhail Kutuzov assumed total responsibility as chief commander, accountable to the emperor and responsible for the army and the war outcome. All contemporary French historical sources prove that the French considered themselves the winners in the war and approached Moscow expecting to take it over and seeing it as a place where they could finally stop, have a rest and end the campaign. Napoleon spent some time at the city gates waiting for a delegation from the Moscow authorities, but nobody came. Then his soldiers brought some locals to him and they told the emperor that the city was abandoned. That seemed like an odd behavior of the Muscovites. Napoleon was surprised, but not yet cautious. On September the 15th, slow-moving columns of Napoleon's vast army entered the city and settled in the abandoned estates and mansions. Napoleon himself moved into the Kremlin and settled there. Many prominent historians believe that the Moscow fire that occurred on late September the 15th and went on for the next few days ruined the Grand Army. You see, the French troops, who had been longing to reach Moscow and counting to find peace there, arrived in an empty city, abandoned by people, but full of treasures. So the soldiers quickly forgot about discipline and became a crowd of looters and marauders. I believe that the Russians defeated Napoleon's army in the Moscow fire. First, the French troops smelled the gold. Their backpacks were filled with valuables, and they were thinking not about heroic fights, but bringing these things home safe. Secondly, all Russians witnessed the fire. Moscow at that time was not an official capital, but people perceived it as a sacred city. The French troops saluting in Moscow triggered nothing but hatred. The decision-making Russian nobility lived in St. Petersburg and couldn't care less about the looting, contrasted to ordinary people whose axes were the main weapons in any war. The Russian army left Moscow and went southeastwards, followed by avant-garde units of Marshal Murat. Shortly, the Marshal discovered that he was chasing only some Cossacks, while the army had disappeared. That was an unexpected Tarutino maneuver from southeast to southwest. The Russian troops were now deployed southwestwards, not far from Moscow, but their disposition threatened the French retreat routes. After a month in Moscow, Napoleon decided to leave the city, understanding that the war was not over. And so Napoleon needed to get back to Smolensk, where his rearguard military officials had paved the way for further assaults.
База для ведения операций.
Kutuzov был уже предупрежден.
Kutuzov had already been warned. His cavalry regiments were closely watching the Moscow suburbs, and the commander didn't miss Napoleon's retreat from the city. Then, a not-so-well-known Battle of Maloyaroslavets took place. It appears to be one of the biggest events of the 1812 war, and that was its turning point. The town changed hands 8 times, with new troops joining in, Russian and French divisions being reinforced with new regiments and new divisions. Each time the Russians pushed the French from the heights to the mouth of the Luja River. The latter tried to storm the heights again, but they were impossible to get. The battle was over only about 10 p.m. The city was all wooden, and its buildings caught flames from the fire of hundreds of cannons. All the French saw afterwards was ruins. However, this didn't change much for Napoleon. You see, during the battle, when the French managed to take the city, suffering great losses, part of the Russian army that was not engaged in the fight was moved to the south of the city, blocking the road to Kaluga for the Frenchmen. The emperor realized that he lost this battle strategically, even though he gained control over Russian positions. So Napoleon decided to retreat back to Smolensk, which was an important turning point in the war. For the first time, the Grand Army, led by Napoleon himself, had to turn back and retreat facing the enemy. Napoleon's empire started to fall apart there, under Maloyaroslavets. Smolensk turned into a big tragedy for the Frenchmen and primarily for Napoleon, as the troops were short of food, while all food stocks in the city were looted. After spending a couple of days in Smolensk, Napoleon had to leave and order further retreat. The Berezina battle was planned already when the Russian army was at the Tarutino encampment and earlier in St. Petersburg. Alexander I expected the 3 Russian armies, the main one led by Field Marshal Kutuzov, the south-based Danube army led by Admiral Chikchagov, and the First Corps of General Wittgenstein that was defending St. Petersburg and advancing from the north to rejoin on the Berezina River, to encircle Napoleon and give him the final battle or make him put the sword down, as Russian troops finally outnumbered Napoleon's army. Many historians were amazed how Napoleon managed to escape from this trap, as he had some 35–40,000 troops compared to some Russia's 120,000 that were approaching from different sides. Moreover, the French army had a river to cross. 35,000 ready and rearing Frenchmen were challenged by 35,000 troops in Chichagev's army, plus the same number in Wittgenstein's corps, as well as 70,000 troops in Kutuzov's division in the rear, making it 1 French per 4 Russians. There was no crossing and Napoleon seemed to have no options. He was to die together with what remained of his army. But somehow he managed to outwit Chichagev with smart maneuvers and made him go further south. He also arranged a crossing for his soldiers near the Studianka River. On the 28th, Chichagev's troops left the forest. Marshal Ney's army, comprising 16,000 battle-ready troops, was deployed on the left bank facing the forest. They fought and died like heroes. The crossing of Berezina lasted for 3 days, and the French troops had to fight for all these 3 days against Chichagev's army in the west and Wittgenstein's army in the east. Russians were more numerous, while the French were suffering serious losses. The French succeeded in arranging the crossing for their major forces guards and heavy cuts. After 3 days of fighting, losing some 10 to 15,000 dead and wounded and indefinite numbers of missing soldiers, the major forces of the French army managed to get out of the Berezina trap and keep on moving to Vilnius and Kaunas. It was winter, roads were bad and food was scarce. The Russian army saw the same problems. Kutuzov's army lost some 60% of its forces on their way from Taruchino to Vilnius. They were mainly those who got lost and stayed at hospitals or took shelter in the rear. Losses of this kind could be replenished, contrasted to Napoleon's army, where the best option for a soldier who was lagging behind his unit was to be captured. Only 30,000 troops of 550,000 who had crossed the Niemen River made it back after a year. The Grand Army created by Napoleon to invade Russia was shattered in 6 months, and this made the French army look less invincible. That was the moment for all Napoleon's enemies in Europe to realize that the French could be defeated, especially with sufficient forces. In late December 1812, the French troops left the Russian Empire. And on December the 25th, January the 7th, according to the then Julian calendar, Alexander I issued a manifesto that the Patriotic War of 1812 was over.